Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Boundless Plains to Share. My name is Memphis Born Blue, and I'm calling from Gadigal land in Warrung, Sydney. Wherever we're calling in from this evening, we are on Aboriginal land. The Lebanese Muslim Association primarily works on Bidjigal land of the Darug Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people here with us this evening. This land is stolen land. It was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So, National Unity Week. The reason that we are all here this evening, very exciting, is about challenging the real and perceived walls that divide us, and instead focusing on understanding and respecting one another and building community together. National Unity Week began in 2015 as a partnership between the Lebanese Muslim Association and Welcoming Australia. And since its inception, the week has included Welcoming Australia's Walk Together, an event demonstrating support for refugee and asylum seeker communities, and National Mosque Open Day, organised by the Lebanese Muslim Association, which is an opportunity for the general public to visit local mosques and have important conversations about Islam, Muslims, and Islamophobia. So tonight's discussion is about the experiences of refugee communities in Australia. Finding a place to rent, a job, a school for kids, accessing health services, and developing a sense of community and belonging is difficult for anyone. But these are all things that individuals settled in Australia as refugees have to navigate, as well as other obstacles associated with forced displacement. In light of hostile media attention and divisive political narratives, the panelists this evening are going to talk about these challenges and how Australia and Australians can be more welcoming to our neighbours. Initially, the fantastic Grace Edward was going to be moderating this evening's panel. However, Dr. Nora Amath is unable to make it this evening and sends her apologies. And Grace has very kindly agreed to be part of the panel and share her experiences working in community. Thank you, Grace. In preparing for National Unity Week, Grace and I had several discussions about Boundless Plains to Share as a title and what that meant, and how we both perceived Australia's treatment and view of refugee communities. And I'd like to now invite Grace to share her reflection on what Boundless Plains to Share means. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Memphis. Before I share that, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining from. I am joining from Yagara and Turrbal country here in Nynjin, Brisbane, which is in Queensland. My reflections on the title of this webinar are, apart from it being a lyric in the Australian national anthem, Boundless Plains to Share to me means that we as migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, anyone who has sought refuge or come to call this land home, we are more than the one-dimensional way in which we are perceived and or represented. And that sometimes is only through the lens of our refugee experiences, our trauma, or whatever propaganda is being pushed in the media. So today, I feel like we are here to speak about the less palpable experiences of life in Australia as people who have sought refuge on this beautiful country, and go beyond the language, culture shock, or things that I guess are tied to the refugee journey that are more, I guess, known widely by the Australian community. So I feel like we're here for truth telling and to address the inequities and systemic barriers within health, education, employment, and even as far as systemic racism. And we're here to value and listen to the experiences that will be shared by the panelists. I wrote this when I was still going to moderate, by the panelists, but also I guess see what else comes from this discussion and the questions that you will share with us as attendees, and share recommendations and discuss how we can all be part of building a better Australian community that values unity and inclusivity.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Anna and Emil, for joining us as well. I'd just like to introduce the panelists to the audience this evening. So Anna is the co-founder and CEO of Refugee Talent, who partners with Talent Beyond Boundaries, providing international refugee recruitment programs, connecting over 30,000 refugees displaced globally with employers in Australia to fill critical skill gaps. Our next speaker, Emil, thank you for reappearing. Emil is the former youth member for Woodridge and former president of the Rwandan Association of Queensland. He is now a restorative justice coordinator and is on the board of directors for Initiatives of Change Australia. And Grace, who we've already heard from, is a storyteller, artist, and playwright, and as a day job, works as the Partnerships and Community Engagement Coordinator at Refugee Health Queensland. Grace uses art and creativity to investigate what it means to be a third culture child and a person of colour living on stolen land. And before we get into the discussion, I'd like to thank two more people here this evening, Rebecca and Tanya, who will be interpreting this panel this evening into Auslan. Thank you both very much for being here this evening. And to the audience, when you have any questions throughout the discussion, feel free to pop them in the Q&A, and we will be able to get to them at the end of our panel discussion. So I'd like to start off the discussion this evening with a broad question. Maybe Emil, I can start with you. In your line of work, what are the biggest challenges faced by refugee communities when settling in Australia?
Thank you very much. Also acknowledging that I'm speaking on the land of the Walker people in Queensland here. And I will respond to this question as I reflect back on some of the challenges I faced and my family faced when we first moved here. And one of the major challenge as I look back and as I do observe how other migrants are settling here is around the way migrants or refugees migrate with conflict. So when we arrive here, we have us looking at where we came from, have lived in refugee camps for over 10 years. Some have lived in refugee camps for all their lives. Some have lived in refugee camps for generations over generations. So when they sort of move here, we migrate with conflict. We migrate with the trauma, and this can have a drastic consequence around trauma, around issues around social exclusion, issues around how we engage with services, mainly our education and health sector. For people who have lived in a disadvantaged, I'll say, reflecting on the refugee side of things, that conflict to migrate here sort of leads into other issues. It can often lead to even issues around internal broken homes where we are unable to adapt to the new system in Australia here, where we issues around culture. When we are here in Australia, which culture do we belong to, or how do we balance where we came from and where we are in terms of our cultural lenses? The last point which really came to mind when I was reflecting to this question was around unrealistic dreams and expectations. So before we move here, some have dreams, some have really looked towards to those particular dreams and expectations. Moving to Australia and with the new changes around new language, new culture, new systems, that can also be a challenge, and dreams are often cut short. And that can lead to a few other issues which can lead into mental health, and a lot of issues that also the welcoming community do present. So we heard about racism, we heard about people who do really struggle to be part of this Australian community in relation to what you see on the media. So I'll potentially round up to those issues with the main emphasis on the things we come with here and how they affect the way we engage with opportunities and services in Australia.
Thank you, Emil. There's definitely things I want to come back to in that. But before we do that, Anna, what are the biggest challenges you see in the refugee communities that you work with?
Well, my co-founder Narari has a saying, there's no settlement without employment. And so employment is the number one issue that I've seen. And from Narari's own experience as a refugee coming to Australia from Syria, Narari had a master's in IT, 10 years experience, spoke perfect English, and couldn't break through the traditional job market like Seek and applying direct to companies like many other refugees experience. And employment gives so many things to somebody's life, from self-esteem, money, connections to people in Australia, being able to build your future, learning those slang words that we use in Australia and understanding those subtleties of culture. And so really that was a problem we aimed to solve through refugee talent initially. So employment is a big one, and I think can help solve some of those other issues that refugees can face when they do come to Australia after experiencing conflict. The other main one I would say is through our Talent Beyond Boundaries international recruitment program that we run. With that program, we actually match a refugee candidate with a job before they even arrive to Australia. And of course they come with their family. So often the primary person that starts work straight away, integrates, make connection in the community, but it's often their partner who might not be working yet and might not want to work yet. It's really important that we connect that person with, other people, either from their community, English classes, activities.
Oh, we may have just lost Anna. That's all right. When she comes back, until she comes back, Grace, maybe we can go to you. What are the challenges that you see in the communities that you work with?
So I guess because I work in two completely different fields, I'll try and answer this question for both. So in the arts, and as Memphis mentioned in my bio, the type of art that I do is to explore, I guess, what life is like for someone who is a person of color or for myself, a third culture child, as I've grown up in three different places in this world before coming to Australia. So it really explores that and the set of, I guess, barriers that come with that, whether it's racism or discrimination or even, I guess, our own perception of ourselves due to how society has viewed us for a long time. And then when I come to health, it's more about health literacy and understanding how to navigate the Australian health system, or the lack of, I guess, information in presented in accessible ways for our communities to be able to digest and understand. And I think that, this pandemic, and I know we will talk about COVID and stuff a bit later, but this pandemic has really highlighted some of those barriers I think highlighted them in a major way and brought them to the forefront of a lot of conversations. But I think also in terms of literacy, I think literacy goes across the board. And when I arrived to Australia, that was in like 2003, and I was really young then. But what I noticed is that now our settlement services have moved ahead of where we were, I guess, at that time, wherein that, I guess, there's a lot of focus now on really making sure that people understand the different systems that govern them here. And I think that's also really, really important alongside employment and and education and finances, and having a place to live that isn't too expensive and big enough for your family. I think that literacy and understanding of, say, the justice system, the health system, the government, and how the different, I guess, levels of government work and interact with each other. I think that's also something that has been brought to the forefront in this pandemic, seeing which levels of government, or who is leading this pandemic response in government as well. I think that's brought a lot of questions. So yeah, literacy as a whole, I think it's another issue, that a barrier that I think hinders us from truly settling and truly feeling like we understand and know our environment and where we're living.
Yeah, I think that really nicely ties into our next question about the COVID-19 pandemic. Grace, you mentioned literacy and understanding the systems, bridging that knowledge gap that people have who haven't grown up here. What are some of the key barriers as well that impacted refugee communities during the COVID-19 pandemic and all the lockdowns, do you guys think? Maybe Anna, because you just dropped out as well, you could.
Yes, sorry, laptop died. Thank you. Yeah, for us with our international recruitment program, obviously the borders closing presented the biggest barrier and and delay. So we had candidates that had already got their visa, were ready to come to Australia, ready to start work, but with the border being closed, and we just weren't able to get them in. And even now, we've had to get travel exemptions for people, and they might be granted those, but then it was actually getting them on a flight, and then the cost of the flight might have been $5,000-$10,000 one way, instead of a normal price of maybe $1,500 or something one way. So to get a family of 4 or something out here was suddenly costing a business who pays for the flights a ridiculous amount. So yeah, that's kind of been the main barrier for us, and that's resulted in our candidates who've been based, for example, in Lebanon or Jordan, and Lebanon in particular, everyone might be across the situation there that there's no electricity, and the situation is just dire there. So people are running out of money and can't work. So yeah, really our candidates are in a really even worse situation. And then you got on top of that the situation in Afghanistan as well, and trying to move people out is very difficult. So yeah, really the border closure has been a huge impact. But yeah, luckily we're seeing in the next month that opening up, which is great, so we can get people out.
Awesome. Grace, what would you say are the, sorry, Emil, did you want to jump in there?
So yeah, why not? I think one of the huge impact we have had, or I have observed, has been associated with loss of employment. So a lot of refugees and migrants do engage in unskilled labor. So a lot of do work in factories, so a lot of work on farms. So and when COVID hit, those jobs were deeply affected. And lack of employment has led to isolation. And in the space of refugee and migrants, isolation can lead to triggering a lot of memories and a lot of past events. That has also led to a loss of hope and purpose for a lot of young people who come from refugee, migrant background. In addition to that, we have observed and also experienced issues around navigating our systems. Two major systems which have been a really huge challenge were in health. So the way we engage with the health system, though we did engage during our COVID pandemic, a lot of systems moved to mobile phone call consoles, and with a lot of our migrants having a few challenges around utilizing our smartphones and technology. So we had a lot of people who missed appointments, who sort of were lost touch of our health system. people who had regular consults with their GPs, those with chronic health. That has been a really huge challenge. The other one, which has affected a lot of youth, has been access to education. So where a lot of our parents have minimal understanding of how our educational system works, to then bringing kids and young people to be educated in their homes. I think this has affected many families to the U12s who were due to, who did finish last year, and even this year. Lockdown has created a massive toll to unemployed parents who have lost a sense of hope and a purpose on whether they'll be heading back, as well as just being able to navigate the system, since we have sort of moved to mobile and using technology, which is a huge barrier within our migrant refugee communities.
Yeah. Thank you. It's very interesting to think about the disproportionate effect of students learning from home on refugee communities. Grace, what are some of the other key barriers or key challenges that have been associated with the COVID-19 packdown that have disproportionately affected refugee communities?
Yeah, I think there are many barriers that, have been brought to the forefront since this pandemic hit. And I think it varies with each community and also each person about, what are the top priority things that really affected them during this time. But I think in general, as a whole, and, what Anna and Emil touched on as well, a very valid points, but in general, just equitable access to healthcare and information. The way in which we used to access healthcare has changed drastically during, the pandemic, because the hospitals were not allowing as many people to go in and visit. Sometimes when lockdowns were in place, you couldn't even go and see your family or your loved ones. The way we go and see our family doctors or go to the hospital for a specialist appointment also changed. A lot of appointments were moved to telehealth, and for a lot of people who don't know what telehealth is or even how to go about getting a telehealth appointment, that became a barrier. A lot of services were moved online, and we know that technology is a huge barrier for some of our communities. So how is someone who is not technology literate supposed to suddenly change the whole way of how they used to access these services and move it online? I think also lack of trust for community in government and in the healthcare system. I think that for the first time was really understood by the government and by the health system, really how little trust there is in that from culturally and linguistically diverse communities or from refugee background communities, because of the histories in which we have experienced before coming to this country. And I think just a few things that a few learnings that I guess we've gotten in this time is the importance of informal and formal community leaders and the importance of meaningful engagement to build trust with the community in order to pass on messaging or about COVID-19, or just to build trust and in the government and in the systems that govern us as well.
That idea of building trust is really interesting. How do you think, and I'll open it up to the other panelists as well, how do you think service providers, but also the government, could build trust with our refugee communities?
Oh,
does anyone want to go first?
I sort of lead up, add a little comment which may provide a segue to building trust.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I think, looking at the learnings around COVID-19 situation, was that we all of a sudden came to realize that the pandemic didn't belong to individuals or classes or particular races within our communities. We realized that COVID, the situation belongs to all of us, and every single person had a role to play, whether you were a migrant, irrespective of way people identify themselves as. So I think that sense of collective understanding and sharing the burden, I think will probably come down a little bit further, discuss about how media behaved, or how media has behaved in the last 24 months. But a massive learning cave, which we took away from COVID, and I think also leads to trust building between systems and communities, has stemmed from the notion of COVID was there for us, and we needed every single person to play their role for us to develop resilience and go through the pandemic. So I think moving on to trust, a particular example that Grace has really put forward on how our community leaders and people who are in community, who serve community 24/7, and how they managed to build that bridge. I think a courteous reminder to people in decision making positions to remain in contact with community through people who are on the ground. And I think if we can enable and break down those barriers that exist between an ordinary person in the context of the discussion today, maintaining regular contact with a migrant or someone who came from a refugee background, that would enhance trust. And a particular example which I have been part of has been building trust and learning from the resilience that First Nations Australians have that carry within themselves, and then as well as within their own communities. COVID-19 has not been the first pandemic we have experienced in Australia here. And looking at our Indigenous communities who have survived many pandemics, and looking at the resilience and the trust they have managed to build to the present moment, I think I was quite moved by how initiatives of change looked at this pandemic and what we can learn from it, with a strong focus on Indigenous communities in terms of how they have survived and come about, and how they have faced issues and pandemics of all sorts of forms, and still remain hopeful and positive and optimistic, even during our COVID situation that continues to affect us even on this day.
Yeah. Anna, how can service providers and government build trust with communities?
I think it's engaging with those community leaders. You know, people trust the leaders in their own community. So government and service providers need to tap into all those community leaders to brief and engage them, and then those people can help communicate it back, you know, to their own communities. So yeah, I would say that's probably one of the key things that government and providers can do to spread the you know, the health messages.
Yeah. Grace?
I was on another webinar at the end of last year, and someone on that panel named Marco said that COVID-19 has sent Australia to its room to reflect on what and how it had been governing, treating its people, and in the hope that coming out of that reflection, Australia as a whole and all of us with it would have a better understanding of, I guess, how to better engage, create accessible opportunities for our communities, but also be more united, support one another, and treat one another better. And what Emil said about COVID belongs to all of us, no matter how wealthy, how poor, where you're from, or you know, the type of life you lead. It belongs to all of us because it's affecting all of us, all of the world. And I guess on that, what I've really learned during this pandemic is the power of working together and the power of partnership, collaboration, calling someone and say, hey, how can I help? How are you doing? What do you need help with? How's your week going? How are you coping in lockdown? All those sorts of things, I think, are part of what building trust is all about, building community and just being there for one another and supporting one another. So in terms of, yes, building trust, it is about what Anna said. It's engaging with those people in different communities that are trusted voices that can help in passing on a message, but also supporting them in ways that that passing on of the message can be done in a sustainable way for them. Yeah.
That's really interesting, the notion of sustainable, like keeping it sustainable for community leaders as well, because, you know, they are acting in these bridges a lot of times in their free time, not necessarily in paid roles. So burnout and sustainability are really important.
Segment I can potentially add there
Go ahead.
around COVID as well, the importance of community and the importance of belonging. So a lot of migrants and people from refugee background, we have, and the way we engage with media and even watching TV and keeping up to date to the news, we then saw the new ways of communication through platforms such as WhatsApp, where people who belonged in community were up to date. People who belonged somewhere, information was easily accessed through their own languages and within dialects. So I think a sort of takeaway, and in terms of how we can build trust, will come down to power belongs to community, and community leaders hold so much power and they hold so much responsibility. And I think they are there to maintain cohesion and maintain how people behave and respond to decisions that leaders and people in position of power do put forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Emile, you mentioned before media, and this is my favorite question of our panel discussion, because I think it's really important. Given the media narratives and the political narratives that we see about refugees, how do each of you think we can inject truth into the depiction of refugees in media? Who would like to? Emile, feel free to kick us off.
I will potentially kick off to the experience of refugees. So for people who have lived in refugee camps, or people who have lived in those sort of environments, and who have experienced the worst of the West when it comes to media. So I'll potentially focus on the Rwandan genocide, where, and as well as the events which unfolded post our genocide. Media played a huge role in how things unfolded. So for people who have experienced such trauma to then be exposed to toxic media, to toxic media that we did so during the pandemic, I think was really shocking and embarrassing. To the media which are targeted migrants and refugees, who are some of the most marginalized and vulnerable communities here, to then be targeted and be used as an example for bad community reputation side of things. I think it's really shocking and really embarrassing. I think during the pandemic in Queensland here, we had situations where the media worked against migrants and people of color, to be more specific, where even walking on the streets or even being in the public, people think twice because of the information that the media was portraying and producing to communities and to the wider public. In terms of what would I love to see being injected in the media, I think refugees and migrants carry so much resilience, they carry so much wisdom, and they carry so much experiences that can be a gift to Australia. And I think if we can capture the resilience and the energy and the motivation that we bring here, I think things can start to change. For people who have lived in camps for over 20 years, for over 50 years, for generations after generations, they have so much to offer. And I think that's one of the gaps that the mass media in Australia seems to be missing around injecting the good stories and success stories that refugee and migrants bring here, capturing the gift. So gift, whether that comes in terms of skills, in terms of talents, in terms of knowledge and different views and different perspectives. I think that's a gap and an injection we would love to see penetrated through the media. And I think that will have a huge, huge impact in terms of the confidence and the self-esteem we work with as refugees and migrants in Australia.
Speaking of so much to offer, Anna, what stories would you like to see in Australian media about refugee communities?
More positive stories where businesses have employed people from refugee background, because we find when we place, someone into employment, often, we think, oh, we changed a refugee's life, but actually we're also changing people that work in that business, and often business are giving us feedback, all their employees are really engaged, and as part of that process of moving someone across the world and changing that family's life, but it's giving that business more purpose. It's a win-win. They're getting skills and talent that they need in their business, but also changing someone's life at the same time. So it's making better businesses, businesses, when that issue is a bit closer to home, you have colleagues who are from, or been through war, or when you're just seeing something on the news, it's easy to just disassociate with what's going on. But when you have people, in your organization who you chat to about the news and issues going on, people can mobilize and use their business power and spending power, hiring power that they have as an organization to do good at the same time as doing business. So more positive stories about how it can be a win-win for business and refugees.
Thank you. And Grace, you talked about in your little introduction about identity and that being really important. What sort of stories would you like to see, and why would they be important for communities' identities?
Instead of just touching on what stories I would like to see, perhaps I'll talk about what stories I'm sick of seeing. And maybe that will be telling to maybe lead down a path of, I guess, the stories we should be telling, or rather, who should be leading that storytelling. And I think in leading to what stories I'm sick of seeing is that what we lack in different, I guess, sectors or in the media is biodiversity, the diversity of people who can self-represent or pull up a story before it's actually shared and say, this is wrong because of this is why it's going to affect this community in this way. This is harmful and unethical storytelling or ways of writing media articles that do not need certain things mentioned because they will incite hate and discrimination and racism when put out into the public. And we've seen so many examples of that. And in fact, this week we're seeing another example of that, where the Somali community is being targeted because of what happened in the UK in the media, because of one person's actions. So I think I'm sick of seeing stories where it's not really about the person, but rather who supported and helped the person. And I guess an example of that is a organization or something saying, hey, look, this refugee is great because we helped him and we supported him, and now he is a good citizen. And because he's a good citizen and we helped him, it reflects better on our organization, rather than telling the story of that individual, independent of what the organization has done or how it has helped them settle or whatnot in this country. And I think part of that is that people from refugee backgrounds, people of minority communities are not being put in the forefront of telling their own stories. We're not in a place where we're self-representing. Our stories are being told for us, on behalf of us, and sometimes they're inauthentic in the way we're being represented. And in saying that, in different levels of media, whether it is for storytelling, whether it's in the news, whatever medium it is being told through, we need to create more pathways for journalists of refugee, migrant, minority backgrounds to be the ones to tell those stories, to be the ones to go and do those interviews. Because if you don't understand the context in which that individual is living from, seeing the world from, you can never write their story or authentically. And also in terms of the arts, we need more opportunities for producers who are from those backgrounds. And a great example is Santilla Singape, who just did a ABC documentary called Our African Roots, documenting the stories of African convicts who came with the First Fleet. We would not have seen that story being told had it not been a producer of African background at the forefront of telling that. And it would not have been as culturally safe or appropriate or authentic representation as it was if it wasn't a producer from that background, from that understanding, from that context, telling that story. So I know this is a very long-winded answer.
No, it's fantastic. And feel free
I-
to, Anna and Emil, jump, also respond in a minute, but sorry, Grace, you keep going.
I think that was the end of my point.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I definitely think that providing platforms, oh, Emil, go ahead.
No, you go.
Providing platforms for people to, or creating spaces where people from refugee backgrounds can tell their own stories. As you were saying, Grace, context is so important. And for someone who has lived experience, being able to report on situations or experiences is so important. Otherwise, how is someone going to get the most full picture of a situation or an experience? Emil, did you want to jump in?
I'll potentially put a lot of emphasis on access to opportunities. I think even to this day, a lot of people from our refugee migrant communities do have to work extremely hard to prove competency in terms of, in the workplace, employment-wise, and that really creates a very small scope for refugees and migrants to be in those positions where they can influence how public opinions as well as perceptions and perspectives of refugees and migrants. I will probably shift to what I would love to see in the media, sort of component what Grace has raised. We would love to see stories of hope, stories of success, and stories which uplift human spirit and which really embraces the diversity and cultures that refugees and migrants bring to Australia. We would love to see refugees and migrants reflected in arts, in the education, in the corporate world, in businesses. We would love to see really an honest. So we often go to meetings, we often raise our concerns, but often and most of the times, conversations remain on our platforms. So we really don't really move forward to take actions towards having organizations and initiatives that represents communities, the diversity that we now have in Australia. More around the interest that media often what are the interests that the media is after and what are the interests that communities often want. So with a lot of knowledge in media, I would be moved to understand that a lot of mass media will be interested to provide exceptional stories or exceptional stories, and most of the times those exceptional stories are produced at the expense of refugees and migrants.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the times they will capture something which will make the news exceptional, and that leads to more views and a lot of things which we have seen unfold within refugees and migrant communities. So
Yeah.
we would love to see a reverse of that, where they capture exceptional stories that bring refugees and migrants at the forefront of what's happening in Australia. So looking at decision making, looking at access to arts, looking at access to be able to engage in competitive sporting. I think we still do see a lack or unequal representation of refugees and migrants in the sporting industry. So I think there's opportunities for media to tap into those areas, get views, get good outcomes, but doing things which uplift our spirit and uplift the voices of migrants and refugees in Australia.
It's interesting that you bring up exceptional, because last night, the Welcoming Australia, in collaboration with Monash, held a panel called Racism It Stops With. And part of the discussion was about this need for exceptions to be celebrated, not the everyday. And I think that's what you mentioned that just then, Emil. Why does Australia and Australian media have an obsession, do you think, Grace, with the exception, but not everyone?
I guess because and in my opinion, the exception means that there is a success in the settlement narrative that, look, we have succeeded in settling this person. But in that success, I think the question needs to be asked, does the person that Australia perceives has successfully settled, has successfully integrated into Australian society feel the same? Do they still have a sense of belonging? What have they lost along the way of this successful settlement? Do they feel that they are in their full selves and feel as if they can walk into any room and be who they are? Bring their, for example, Africanness in its fullness, and bring their Australianness in its fullness and marry it? Or are they just code switching? And for anyone who doesn't understand or know what code switching is the fact that when you're in a room full of Anglo-Australians, you do present yourself in a different way. And why? Because you feel as if you in your full self is not accepted in that room. So therefore you have to switch. You have to behave, act a certain way than you would if you were at home with your family. And I don't mean that in the sense that, you know, you're being, that it's bad in any way. You should be able to feel free to be who you are, no matter who is in front of you. And I guess that question needs to be asked to those people who are seen as the success of whatever it is, settlement or the exception, you know.
Yeah. Funnily enough, someone just asked that the question that we just discussed in the Q&A. Anna, I'd like to ask you a question about what, and then I'll open it up to the other panelists, what can everyday businesses and Australians more broadly do to welcome people from refugee backgrounds?
Well, there's a couple of different refugee programs in Australia. One, there's the one that we run with Talent Beyond Boundaries, which is business led and business hiring a refugee. Then you have the humanitarian program, which is the government's commitment through refugee service providers to settle refugees every year. And then you also have the community refugee sponsorship initiative. So really it depends, I guess, you know, for people, you know, you can think, well, if you're a business person or you're in an organization and you're hiring, you could hire potentially through our program or volunteer to help interview prep, or even just be a mentor to candidates, you know, when they come over. With the humanitarian intake, you know, you can contact your local refugee organization, and especially at the moment with the Afghan intake, whether it's maybe donating goods or just seeing how you can be involved. Or with the community refugee program, you know, in a certain area where people being settled as well, people could get involved, whether it's teaching English or just being a buddy to, you know, introduce people to your town and things. So I think people can get involved in so many ways, and it just depends on your situation. But by contacting, you know, either your local or Talent Beyond Boundaries, Refugee Talent, or the Community Refugee Sponsorship Program, you know, you can find different ways to get involved.
Emil, what are ways that anyone can work to welcome refugees in their day-to-day life?
So I think I'll add a lot of emphasis on access to opportunities. So when I first moved to Australia, I had spent just over 14 years in a refugee camp, and so I was way behind when it came to education. An ordinary 14-year-old Australian usually have had some shifts at McDonald's or Hungry Jacks. So I think one of the gifts, or one of the most important someone that did for me when I first moved to Australia here, was to show me where opportunities were and held my hand and really supported those early days. And through our early shifts at McDonald's, we're able to continue on to have a sense of belonging and really feeling connected that this is where we are, and this is home. So I think either our businesses or organizations, or for us who have lived here for quite some time, we don't have to look too far or make it a big deal. If there is any opportunity that is my way, or whether that could be formal or informal, any connections to local organizations. So a lot of respect to the local Rotary clubs in different communities I've seen around. They really go above and beyond to welcome Australians, to really give them a space and help walk with them, instead of this is where you are, go and do you. So I think just inviting and sharing opportunities will go a long way. For people who've done it, for me, I think, and for those around me, our life has been turned around. Should people have ignored me or thrown myself into opportunities without providing that ongoing support, I don't think I would have been the person I am today. So I think opportunities for me carries a lot of weight in terms of what you can do to support refugees and migrants.
Grace, how can everyday Australians and businesses and organisations, but mainly everyday Australians, welcome refugees?
I think just by listening and asking questions, and actually not just listening, but comprehending what it is that that individual, that community, that new arrival really wants, and what will be meaningful for them in terms of their settlement journey here, and understanding the new culture and the new landscape in which they've literally been dropped into to live in. Because sometimes, and most of the times, we do not choose where we go. You know, we, whichever way in which we arrive here, as refugees and or asylum seekers, we do not really choose where it is we want to go. We hope that the place we will arrive to will be a place where we'll get opportunities for education, better living conditions, and a chance for our children and that to have a better future. We don't know what the new culture there will be like. We don't know what the society there will be like. So I think it's about listening and really hearing what it is someone needs and doing your best to meet that need. As a community member, as an organization, at every single level. The most important thing is listening and doing what you can to support that person. And if you are not the right person to be there to take that person's hand and to take them on this journey of finding a new home and belonging in a new place, connect them to someone who can.
Thank you. Before we open up to the Q&A, and I encourage our audience members to pop any questions they have in the Q&A box, I'd just like to do a little plug for our event tomorrow night. It's called Changemakers or Troublemakers, and it's about the experiences of activists in Australia, how they're perceived, how they navigate their activism with the rest of themselves. And so I'll pop that link into the chat, but there's been a really great question that's been submitted, and I think, Grace, I'd really like you to kick this one off. Why is integration something that we expect of new Australians, and can we even define what that looks like?
That is a good question, and I don't think I have the answer to it, but I'll give it a shot. I guess when you look at that question, you have to look at the different waves of migration that Australia has had over the years, and I guess who were the first to settle in this land. And with the different waves of migration, it's been much easier, I guess, for them, although there are different hardships that they would have experienced, and I don't know them because that wasn't my experience, but I feel as if it would have been a lot easier for them to sort of fit into or settle into what is now Australian culture and society and community and life, because their differences weren't so pronounced. But for those who are visibly different, whether it's because of your skin or whatnot, it's a lot harder for you because you have something that is constantly going to be a target. So therefore, integrating is a lot harder. But then again, I think this question is difficult because who is that integration or successful integration defined by? And as far as we know now, it's not defined by those who are the new arrival in that country. It's defined by that community. It's defined by who is already there before as meaningful integration or successful integration. And yeah, exactly. Why are Australians not expected to integrate? Because our culture is changing. You know, the culture I left back home in Sudan would not be the same culture I go back to when I go and visit, because there's been different influences and different things that have changed that, and that has evolved in the way it has. And so is Australian culture and Australian society. So we as new arrivals are expected to know everything there is to know about Australia, Australian people, its culture, and the life here, but they are not expected to understand the same thing about our cultures and where we've come from. So that understanding can bring forth the development of a new community that responds to the need that is there right now. So I don't know if that answers your question, if that brings more questions, but those are my thoughts and reflections on that.
For me, it definitely brings more questions, and I'm interested to hear what Anna and Emil think, because if we do hear these calls in the media from our politicians that say, like, oh, we need your refugee communities to integrate. But I'm sure that if they were asked what integration looks like, how would they define it? What are the steps? It might become a bit trickier, and they'll be like, no comment. But Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I want to flip it and say, you know, I want people that have had to flee here, you know, people from refugee background don't choose to come, they are forced to come. So really, you know, the question I want to ask people is, do you feel home here now? You know, and if someone says yes, then I feel like then we have welcomed them and we have given them invitations to settle well in Australia. So really, I don't think it should be integration, but do people feel like now this is, of course their home is, their original home, but while they're here or, they can't live back home, they should feel like this is their home. And I think that's the question I ask people. And, then I think, yeah, this is success in my mind, rather than saying, yeah, have they integrated to what Australians think? So do people feel at home now? That's what I think we should be asking.
I love that. Emil?
So potentially ask a question, a question which tends to that is around what do they integrate into? Are they integrating into the Australian culture? If that's so, what is it? Are they integrating it? I guess what are they, what do we want them to integrate into? So that's one sort of question, reflection question which came to mind. And the other one was around how do we know that this person has been fully integrated? What measurement? Who measures? What standards do we set? Who sets up those standards? And that leads into a lot of questions around how do we define our common, or how do we define an Australian culture? So it's sort of a confusing question I have heard, and I do hear every now and then, but also brings about a few other reflective questions. However, I often do invite people who ask those questions to change the word integration into transition.
Mm-hmm.
Has this person fully transitioned into the way of living and how an ordinary Australian engages with opportunities that this great country offers? And what can we do on all levels, from families, communities, organizations, and initiatives? What role can they play to ensure that people can transition effectively into the way we live and the challenges as well as the opportunities we have right here in Australia? But yeah, so that would be my 2 cents contribution to that.
What you've just said ties really well into a question that came through the chat, which says, young refugees face particular challenges because of their age and experiences. They carry scars of war and displacement with them. Some beautiful writing for this question. Sometimes children are forced to flee alone and arrive in Australia as unaccompanied minors. What is our responsibility to them? Emil, I think that touches upon what you were just saying, actually. Would you like to respond to that?
So I've talked to people who work with unaccompanied minors, and it's a really, 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 really challenging world to work in. Refugees, especially young people, do carry significant traumas. Some have denied their identity. So in refugee camps, some had to hide and belie their names, and some had gone through horrific torture that we cannot even imagine. So when they sort of come through in Australia, where we have settlement services, but then we have issues around, are the services equipped to empower and support refugees on their recovery journey? So I think that's a big piece we have seen missing in the gaps in services. So we are there to provide employment, there to look at how do we engage with them to be involved in local initiatives. But then there's issues around how do we, are we funded or are we fully grounded to help that recovery journey, which goes towards around mental freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at that particular question in terms of the challenges that unaccompanied minors face, I think I don't have an absolute response to it, and I wish I had an answer to that. But what an Untitled Australia could potentially offer the support will be providing that space to listen to their stories, to listen to who they are, to really listen and be part of their journey. And that could, in a practical sense, regular conversation and follow-ups around how things are traveling for them. Is there anything that Amir could be doing to help you transition successfully into the way we live in Australia? The other segment, also a challenge will be around how our look at child safety and child welfare and how they sort of engage. We'll tie back to something that Grace mentioned earlier, that there's a lack of people who have lived experience, people who potentially have the right skills, but we are not seeing them in the right professions that can provide enough and the right support that refugees and migrants, especially unaccompanied minors, carry. So if, I guess, tapping into those resources that refugees and migrants carry here, utilizing our lived experiences, utilizing community groups and community leaders to be at the forefront, I think that could potentially break down barriers and some of the challenges that unaccompanied minors do face when they are here in Australia.
Francis, you are on mute.
Okay. Grace, would you like, or Anna, would either of you like to talk about how we can support unaccompanied minors?
I do not know much about the type of support that is currently offered to unaccompanied minors, but I think in terms of more support, if this isn't already being done, that could be offered to them, is linking them to their community. Firstly, in whichever state they are in, and I don't know, sometimes that can be a safe thing to do, or sometimes being around their community could be harmful to them as well, or not a place they find that is safe for them. So again, it goes back to listening to what that child needs to be able to feel safe, to be able to, I guess, find belonging and find a home in this country. But I also think finding them mentors to support them in their journey and support them in what they would like to do in the future with their lives. But I think finding a safe home for them is definitely somewhere they feel safe and comfortable living in is the first and foremost priority. Yeah.
No, I won't add anything there. Emile and Grace, I think you've summed it up nicely.
I think our theme is on boundless plans to share. I think even that, for me, sort of brought into mind the notion of reuniting kids and their families. If we are, I think the theme speaks to that effect. Just to really mention issues around isolation and mental health. So these are on mental health side of things. A lot of refugee migrants, in terms of trauma and mental health, those words can be quite foreign and quite threatening. And I have seen where unaccompanied minors do then engage in substance misuse to gain that sense of hope and purpose. And I think that's just really just emphasizing and painting a picture of some of the challenges they do face. But to the theme we are discussing on tonight.
Thank you, Emile. Speaking of themes, actually, build community is the theme for this year's National Unity Week. And you said something before, Emile, and I'd like to invite everyone to reflect on this. You said COVID is everyone's problem. And I think in a more positive sense, building community is also everyone's responsibility. So maybe to conclude this evening, we have a couple of minutes left. How do each of you think we can build community? And while you're reflecting on that, I'm also going to pop the link to tomorrow night's panel into the chat for everyone to access. But please, how can we build community?
I'll jump in first if Anna and Emil don't mind. I guess in terms of build community, it's really about being inclusive, creating a community where everyone feels safe, feels comfortable to be who they are authentically, finds meaning in their life within that community, in the sense of employment, work, where they live. You know, I think neighborhoods, the suburbs we live in, that impacts us a lot. Even the house that we live in. A lot of people from refugee backgrounds, and I reflect on my own family and within my own culture, we find pride in our home. You know, we take care of it. We enjoy having people over within our home, entertaining them, cooking food, sharing food. And I think because there are a lot of fences and not many people speak to their neighbor. So I think the first thing is speak to your neighbor, know your neighbor, who are they? And I think that once you are in the practice of doing that, it will translate to other aspects of your life, in the way in which you view people and speak to people, and share stories. I think stories are the ways in which we can understand each other the best. And then also, I think in terms of belonging, for anyone, and I'm looking at a question that was put in the chat description, for anyone, not just young people, is representation, seeing ourselves represented within our community, and not just positive. There's always good and bad in each place, but if one community feels as if the way they've been represented all the time is bad and negative, then that isn't going to really help them in finding a sense of belonging, or feeling as if the community they're living in has a place for them.
Mm-hmm.
So representation in all ways, I think, is also important in building community. Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's finding, whatever skills or resources you have. I think of the Afghanistan, situation, and, is something everyone can do, whether it's from a business hiring someone, donating something to your local refugee org, donating your time to, help give someone information about Australia, or how to find those services, holding their hand to that activity. I think it's just, thinking one small action, or whether it's talking to your neighbor, talking to that person at the bus stop. It's just sort of engaging with people, really, in whatever way you can. So just taking action, even a small one.
I will, in addition to Grace and Anna, on the so the issues, the point that change starts with me, and I am a small piece in what I think will go down as the Australian dream. So if I can change, if I can look at how can I be a good neighbor, how can I be a good father, how can I be a good brother, and really carrying that energy that if I can change, and this will lead to the change for those around me, my own family, friends, colleagues, and the entire community will change. So you potentially will bring it back to myself, the decisions I make, the conversations I'm having at my workplace, in community, and how my thoughts and ambitions affect those around me. And that flows into realizing individual potential. And I think we have looked at the resilience, the hopes, and the energy that refugees and migrants bring to Australia. If we are to build sustainable communities, we will then, I think we would need to realize individual potential in either in the formal way or even in the informal in the informal way. There's a concept we use, I think Grace will be quite familiar, the concept of Ubuntu. It's a concept we grew up. It's a concept which helped us to remain motivated and working towards our dreams in situations where those to be steadfast. In situations I guess in situations which would have cut down our dreams and our energy to work towards our dreams. But Ubuntu kept us moving, that I am because we are. What I do and what I think affects those around me. And at the end of the day, I think Australia is home. This is where we want to stay. Some have planned to go home and to go back and visit, but at the end of the day, this is where we are. This is where we are grounded. This is where we hope that our grandkids and people who will come after us in years to come, they'll look back and I think that Amiel and Grace and other Margarets in Australia did build a solid foundation for us. So I think if we also, a really honest conversations, if what to be built in communities around, is this home and how can I make sure that I'm grounded here and our future generations will look to us and really put their thumbs up that we have done our bits with the little experience we brought to this country. I think that sums up to change starts with me.
Thank you very much, Emil. Change does start with all of us. And thank you, Grace and Anna, for being part of this panel this evening and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you, Rebecca and Tanya, for interpreting this evening. I hope the audience has enjoyed listening to this conversation as much as I've enjoyed moderating it. Hopefully see you all tomorrow evening for Changemakers or Troublemakers, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.